And now I shall introduce tonight's speaker. This presentation explores the rich and complex history of Red Hill, the final home and burial site of founding Father Patrick Henry. We will trace Henry's influential life as a fiery orator and advocate for liberty, best known for his iconic declaration, "Give me liberty or give me death." Beyond his public legacy, we will delve into his private life at Red Hill, including his family and the plantation he managed. The program will also shed light on the lives of the enslaved people who lived and labored at Red Hill, acknowledging their contributions and the harsh realities they endured. Additionally, we will examine the Indigenous presence in the region before and during European settlement, highlighting the often looked narratives that shaped the land's deeper history. Cody Youngblood is an architectural historian and the Director of Preservation and Collections at Patrick Henry's Red Hill. He holds a BA in Historic Preservation and Museum Studies from the University of Mary Washington and an MA in the Conservation of Historic Buildings from the University of York. He has formerly served as the Museum Director of George C. Marshall's Dodona, I'm sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, Manor, and Collections Manager at Oatlands Historic House and Gardens in Leesburg, Virginia, where he led significant reinterpretation and refurnishing projects. At Red Hill, Cody stewards a collection of nearly 3,000 artifacts and manages the preservation of its historic built environment. He remains a lifelong tapophile. Please join me in welcoming Cody. Stop my share so you can start.
All right. Well, thank you, Paula, and thank you everyone at GRIVA for inviting me to speak here today. And for those who don't know, a taphophile is someone who loves visiting and learning about cemeteries and graveyards. So I always recommend visit your local cemetery. And of course, being into family history and genealogy, you all know, I'm sure that all too well. Um, but with that, I will share my screen here. There we go. And we'll get started. So, as Paula introduced, I am the Director of Preservation and Collections at Patrick Henry's Red Hill. We are the national memorial designated by Congress to Patrick Henry. But the first question a lot of people ask, if you're not from Virginia especially, is who is Patrick Henry? Well, he was, of course, a founding father, born and raised in Virginia, and he's most famous for his "Give me liberty or give me death" speech that he proclaimed at the Second Virginia Convention. Most people don't know he was the first and sixth elected governor of Virginia, first elected in 1776. Pretty cool. And of course, a plantation owner and enslaver. Henry did live at 13 different homes throughout his life and did enslave people from the time of his first marriage until his death. But he was also a family man and a devout Christian. We'll talk about his family a little bit more, but he did have quite a large number of family members in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And to give you an idea of the size of his family tree, I'll get you started right here. I know it's small font, but will be reading some of the names. So Patrick first began his family with his first wife, Sarah Shelton, whom he married in 1754, and he had six children with her. Unfortunately, Sarah died in 1775, but he remarried 2 years later to Dorothea Dandridge and had 11 children with Dorothea. So when everything was said and done, Patrick had 17 children. Those children would go on to have 77 grandchildren. So, as I like to joke, George Washington was the father of the country, but Patrick Henry was quite literally the father of Virginia. And that is well orchestrated here in this family tree you see. But to give you a little insight into Henry's life, he was born just outside of Richmond, which was a little rural town in 1736, May 29th, 1736, at a place called Studley Plantation. His father was, in fact, a Scottish immigrant and moved to the colony of Virginia in probably the late 1720s. And he had his enslaved carpenters and masons care for the property, which was, in fact, built before his ultimate ownership of it. And he married a woman named Sarah Winston, and with her had several children, with Patrick being towards the middle. And unfortunately, the original home at Studley no longer stands today, but you can see this plat map, which was made of it in 1796, with the dwelling house being letter A just in the front here. You can see it's a little L-shaped house, and to the right side of that L is the nursery, measuring 28 by 24 feet, 1 story high, walls of brick. So that's likely where Patrick was born on the 29th of May in 1736. Now, as Patrick grew up, he tried several different things in his life to raise money. One was, of course, becoming a store owner with his brother. That didn't work out too well. He was, of course, a plantation owner for quite a bit. First began his life as a plantation owner at a place called Pine Slash in Hanover County, but due to a drought and the failure of his tobacco crop, that endeavor also failed. So after he married his first wife, Sarah Shelton, in 1754, he moved into Shelton's Tavern, also known as Hanover Tavern, and he worked as a barkeep there, and helped his father-in-law kind of manage the place. And the tavern just happened to be right across from this building here, Hanover Courthouse. Really beautiful courthouse that still stands today. And because a lot of the magistrates, the judges, and the attorneys would go across the street to imbibe at the tavern, Patrick really got interested in their conversations of the law. So he ultimately decided to read law. It said he was as quick as 6 weeks before he finally went to Williamsburg to take his exam in 1760. And along with those board of examiners, that included a gentleman named George Wythe, who you may know, another founding father from Virginia and a teacher of Thomas Jefferson, in fact. But Henry did succeed at passing the bar in 1760, and he really came to great public attention just 3 years later with something called the Parsons Cause case. You can see a later painting of this case happening in Hanover Courthouse with Henry there, of course, with his arm raised. Now, the Parsons Cause actually occurred in a really stressful time in Virginia. It happened after the passage of what's called the Two-Penny Act. And you may know that the clergy of the time, the parsons, were in many ways paid by the colony, resulting from profits of the sale of tobacco. And when the market was up and it sold for, let's say, 4 pennies per pound, the parsons got a nice chunk of change. But then when the market was down, they, maybe sold them for 1 penny a pound. This Two-Penny Act would ensure that no matter the market change, higher or lower, the parsons would be paid 2 pennies of tobacco per pound of tobacco. And they didn't like this very much because they felt that they were missing out on some payments here. So the Parsons, angry at the Virginia's governing body, the House of Burgesses, brought their complaints to the king himself. And the king struck this law down, made it null and void. Well, now with the law gone, what the heck do the Parsons do now? They sue for back pay for what they believed was their right to receive this pay. So they brought it to the courts. A man named Reverend James Mowry represented the Parsons, and unfortunately for Virginia, the Parsons actually won this case. But they brought in Patrick Henry to defend and against, I guess, too much back pay. He was there to determine exactly how much the Parsons were to be paid. And ultimately, after a fiery speech, the justices found that the Parsons deserved 1 penny in damages. Ultimately, this was a real spark in the firebox of Henry's public career. It said that everyone was so excited after the ruling, they pulled Henry onto their shoulders and brought them across the street to the tavern to celebrate. And in this painting, if you actually look up on the staircase at the top left, you'll see one of the magistrates who is dabbing his wet eye with a red towel. You might be wondering who that is. That is a gentleman named John Henry. He is the father of Patrick Henry. And yes, he was one of the justices who determined this case, of course, before any kind of laws were passed against, Henry being related to each other. But a conflict of interest, you might say. Now, just 2 years later, as a result of Henry's success, He was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses as a delegate from Louisa County, where he had just purchased some land. And he had only been a Burgess for 9 days when on May 29th, 1765, Henry introduced 5 resolutions against the infamous Stamp Act. Now, of course, the Stamp Act was levied by Parliament against the colonies in an effort to pay for the debt that Great Britain had lost from stationing troops in the Americas during the French and Indian War. Um, Henry didn't like this very much, neither did many of the colonists. And Henry was really the first person to speak out against the Stamp Act after it had become law. So he introduced these resolves on May 29th, and on May 30th, he gave a really rousing speech to defend these resolves. And it's really the fifth resolution that was the most controversial because it said that only the Virginia General Assembly, the House of Burgesses, had the right to tax its citizens because they were represented in that governing body. This goes right against what the Stamp Act said with Parliament passing it. Unfortunately, we have no original transcripts of Henry's speech, but we do know the last sentence that he said in that speech. And that's what's depicted here in this painting that's in the collection of Red Hill and is currently on display here. He said something like, Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III made profit from their example. He's essentially calling for the killing of the king. So everyone yells, treason, treason. And Henry responds, if this be treason, make the most of it. Now, because, at least in Henry's favor, many of the members of the House of Burgesses who were there that day were younger, more liberal, all 5 of the resolutions passed and made it into the record. And then they made it into the newspapers of all 13 colonies. So Henry, seeing he won, left Williamsburg. Maybe he was fearing some retribution from the more conservative members. But unfortunately, the next day, during the House of Burgesses convening, the more conservative members came back into the chamber and decided to strike the last resolve from the record. But nevertheless, as I mentioned, all 13 colonies knew about these resolves, including the fifth, because they were printed in the newspapers. Now, Henry's fame continued to grow until he was ultimately chosen to represent his county, Hanover County, in the Second Virginia Convention. And that met at this place, which you probably recognize, a place called St. John's Church in Richmond, Virginia. St. John's Church was really the largest structure in Richmond at this time because it was not yet the capital of the Commonwealth, or the colony at least. And it was a pretty small kind of podunk town, you might say. So it was several hundred members in March of 1775. They clamored into this building, and there was a resolution put forth to decide whether Virginia should raise a militia to defend itself against the rising number of British troops in the colony. This was coming at the same time that the Boston Harbor was blockaded by the British up north. So things were really tense between the colony and her mother country, Great Britain. Henry would ultimately rouse to give his 8-minute long speech where he declared, give me liberty or give me death. And it's said that Henry's words were so powerful that a man named Edward Carrington, who was listening from a window outside the church, declared after the speech, let me be buried on this spot. And when he died later in the 1800s, his wish was carried out. So if you visit St. John's Church, you will see Edward Carrington's grave right next to the window in which he declared those words. And it was really, I think, because of Henry's speech and his actions to push Virginia into a posture of defense that this resolution did pass and a militia was formed in Virginia. Now, in that speech, you may not know that Henry was holding a prop, and it was this very minor piece of whalebone, also called baleen, that Henry held in his hand. He used it as a dagger. He motioned as if to stab himself in the breast when he declared, give me liberty or give me death. And this is, once again, the original paper cutter that Henry held in his hand. It is now in the collection here at Red Hill. But if you're in Richmond, it's currently on display there for a temporary exhibition to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the U.S. at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. So, really, the closest physical connection we have to Henry's speech lies in this paper cutter here. So, a really, really historic item. Now, as Virginia was still toiling with the American Revolution, we had declared our independence July 4th, 1776. And right after that, Henry was selected to become the first elected governor of Virginia. The last royal governor who lived in the governor's palace here was a man named Lord Dunmore. And he had fled from Williamsburg just the year prior. So Henry was coming into a pretty empty palace. He lived here when he married his second wife, Dorothea, ultimately because his first wife, Sarah, would die of complications of an illness just a few years earlier. This is also the location of his first daughter with Dorothea's birth. In fact, she's the still today the only child of a non-royal governor to be born in the governor's palace in Williamsburg. Her name was Dorothea Spotswood, nicknamed Dolly, and she will later be married at Red Hill. So Henry first served 3 terms. They were 1-year terms as governor from 1776 until 1779. Then he stepped back for a few years and came back into the governorship in the 1780s, 1784 to 1786. But at that time, the capital had been moved to Richmond, so that's where he would serve out those last terms. Ultimately, when Henry served his time, he went back into the practice of law for several years, but then it came time for him to settle down. So in 1794, Henry purchased Red Hill, his last and 13th home, and it's ultimately where he would die 5 years later in 1799. Now we switch gears to talking about Red Hill. And as you can see, it has a really storied history going back over 10,000 years. We have a great aerial image here on the left of what Red Hill looks like today. It's certainly changed a lot since Henry's time and definitely since the earliest indigenous settlements. And speaking of indigenous, we'll a little bit more about Red Hill's future history here. We'll, of course, touch on these points a little bit later. Red Hill, in fact, stayed with the Henry family for 150 years until the death of his great-granddaughter, Lucy Harrison, in 1944, and then our foundation purchased the property a year later, and we still own and operate it today. Now, we've done some archaeology here at Red Hill, and the earliest site that we've discovered was from the early Archaic period. So again, from about 8,000 to 6,000 BCE. For those of you who might not be familiar why there's an E on the end of BCE, you may be familiar with BC and AD. BCE is before Common Era, so this is kind of what historians have geared towards using for these dates. Same dates as BC, but then you'll see CE, which is Common Era. So that's instead of using AD. But really early on, from the Pleistocene age in Virginia, the Chesapeake Bay did not exist. It was a small little river, but as we move into the Archaic period, the climate is getting warmer, the sea level rises by about 300 feet, and the Chesapeake Bay is born. Native Americans at this time were using a lot of rock shelters with limestone for more permanent structures, but we're still a really nomadic society at this time. So we're not yet settled down with big family groups. So we're still hunting, roaming around in small bands. And we build our temporary houses out of what we find in the woods, bent wood or logs, and we cover them with things to keep out the rain, straw mats, bark, things like that. And here's an example of what an early archaic camp may have looked like here at Red Hill, for example, in about 6,500 BCE. So we've got those temporary houses you see in the back. We've got people preparing deer skin. Bison by this time was dying out in Virginia, so deer, elk, those are becoming the main animals that the indigenous people are killing and using for hide, fishing as well, and many other aspects that go into supporting this kind of nomadic life. We've also discovered a late woodland period site. This is a permanent village, unlike the temporary camp that we just saw. And now we're getting into CE, so a little bit more modern of 900 to 1600, so right before European contact. And we believe that the folks who were staying here, they're from the Saponi tribe. And this site itself was discovered in 1965 next to the Stanton River, which runs just south of Red Hill. By this time, families are growing. We're not really moving around too much. We're building semi-permanent homes that'll last us about 3 or 4 years before we have to rebuild them. And we also have really significant cultural and social movements happening. We've got to have someone that keeps farming, artistry, land allowance in check. And that's where we get chiefdoms and tribes where we'll have, a head tribesman or a chief, and the social hierarchy is developing here. We're also a little bit worried about some neighbors. We don't really want to be attacked, so we're building palisades. And you can get an idea of what this palisaded village may have looked like. The palisade is obviously running through the middle here. And we have what's called wigwams or wickiups. Those are houses there on the right. Again, a little bit bigger, but more substantial than what we're seeing with the temporary camps. And on the left, outside the palisade, we have a larger, probably a religious or a spiritual building, like a temple, that would be used for a larger gathering space. Moving way ahead to post-European settlement, a gentleman named Colonel Richard Booker, with several other men, purchased thousands of acres in what was then Lunenburg County. Charlotte County, which we're a part of today, was carved out of Lunenburg. And Booker himself owned about 174 acres of what is today Red Hill. He died, and then in 1772, his son Richard Moreau Booker inherited this property, and he was the first to really live here. And his enslaved workers constructed the house and outbuildings before Booker sold the property to Patrick Henry in 1794 for 1,700 pounds. You can see what Booker's house looked like here. It no longer stands today, but you can see it really simple. Probably 20 by 30-foot wood frame structure facing south towards the river, brick or stone chimney. And this was the same house that was here when Patrick Henry moved in 1794. He really did not add on to it. In fact, it was Patrick, his wife Dorothea, about 8 of his kids, and even a ward that he had taken in, his nephew named Johnny Christian. So their bedrooms would have been up on the loft space, or that kind of half story above the windows you see. And because the house was not big enough to fit all of the kids, some of the kids would be moved into another building called the law office, which we'll see in just a moment. And that's how we get into the Patrick Henry era. So again, he's here with quite a large family, but his children from his first marriage are by this time grown up and have moved out of the house. Although Henry was a planter in retirement, he did also distill whiskey. He acquired his license to distill in 1795 and sold about 2,000 gallons of whiskey each year with his distillery. You can actually see an image of Patrick Henry. This was a portrait done from life in 1795. So this is what Patrick Henry looked like when he was living at Red Hill. Just as I mentioned a moment ago, this is the law office, and this is split up into 2 rooms with a central chimney. So on the left, we have Henry's office space where he would have been in charge of keeping care of the account books, handling the day-to-day of the plantation, and even working on some smaller civil cases, despite being largely retired from the law business. And on the right, that would have been the bedroom space for his older children, and probably where he homeschooled some of his children. Another building at Red Hill is the kitchen, really central to our operations at this time because everyone has to eat. And we believe an enslaved cook at Red Hill was named Critty. She was working in this space almost 24 hours a day with a scullery maid to assist her. And Critty was just one of the 67 enslaved individuals who were listed as living at Red Hill at the time of Henry's death in 1799. Critty also had 3 children, one of which we'll talk about a little bit later. He has a pretty significant role in Red Hill's later history. You might be wondering, what did the Henrys enjoy eating? Well, they certainly lived off the land because this was a self-sustaining plantation. So your smoked ham, your roast turkey, your root vegetables, fish, trout, bass from the river, everything that was in season would have been used. And the recipes would have been organized by Dorothea and discussed with the enslaved cook Critty every morning around sunrise. Now, on June the 6th of 1799, Henry is sitting in this very chair that you see here on the right, suffering from a terrible intestinal blockage called intussusception. Say that three times fast. Now, we know that Henry had been dealing with stomach pain as early as April of 1799 when he had complained of feeling something like the gravel in his gut. Gravel is an 18th century term for um, kidney stones. Ultimately, this thing called intussusception would have killed him. And you can see here on the left a diagram of what happens during this illness. Your small intestine essentially acts like a telescope and telescopes into the large intestine, causing a painful blockage. And Henry felt that it was less painful to sit rather than to lie down with this illness. He actually did have a personal physician by the name of Dr. George Cabell, who lived in Lynchburg. Later, Cabell would have Point of Honor built for him, which is also open as a museum. And in keeping with very common 18th century medical um, practices, Dr. Cabell really had one last chance to save his patient, and that was by administering a vial of liquid mercury to Patrick Henry. Now, liquid mercury had been used in the medical field for thousands of years. This was nothing new, even though today I'm sure many of you have gasped at the word mercury. But it was hoped that the weight of this liquid would push the blockage through and Henry could survive. But despite swallowing the medicine, it was too late. It said Henry was sitting in this chair, looking down at his fingertips and watching them discolor as the blood congealed under his fingernails. And finally, on June the 6th of 1799, he said one final prayer, surrounded by his family, and would die at the age of 63. From there, the property was given to his wife, Dorothea, in a will along with his enslaved. But Dorothea had the option to choose two of her sons to give Red Hill to. She ultimately chose John Henry, who you can see photographed here much later in life, and his brother Edward Winston Henry. John was only 3 years old when Patrick died. So about 1810 or so, John is coming of age, and Dorothea finally gives the property to him and his brother, but they decide to split the property in 1814. So John gets this portion of Red Hill, his father's portion. Edward Winston goes off to the east and starts his own plantation called Windstone. John, of course, does continue enslaving people. He has 54 until emancipation comes at the end of the Civil War in 1854. And this photograph was taken about 1860, which is really cool seeing an actual photographic image of him before his death. Now, his father's house just didn't cut it. You can see his father's cottage right here. So in 1832, John Henry decided to hire a builder named Jesse Staples to expand his father's home. So you can see those additions here. The lean-to on the right was called the nursery. It was connected to the larger piece through a little hallway called a hyphen. And then we have that two-story addition there on the left. You'll also notice the front door is flanked by two D-shaped boxwood gardens, and these were planted by enslaved gardeners under the orders of John's wife, Elvira McClellan. You even see quite a tall tree there up on the right, and that was said to be Patrick's favorite tree. It was a kind of a hickory or a hackberry, I believe. And he was known to grab his violin and his canteen and sit under its branches and would play his violin much to the delight of his children. He was, of course, a very musical person, and his son John inherited this gene because he too played the violin, and his violin is now here in the collection at Red Hill. This is what the inside of John's house looked like before some significant additions occurred just a few years later. These are some Henry family members over in the 1890s. You can see pretty simple house with some nice columns and an archway to add some architectural character. Also, during the 19th century in John's era, there was some construction of many other plantation buildings. That included slave quarters and barns, tobacco barns that were built of logs, which you can see an example of here. These two stood at Red Hill. They were built in the 19th century, stood here probably until the early 1950s, maybe late 50s, until they were torn down by our foundation for unknown reasons. But you can see very simple, really built by the enslaved for everyday work. They weren't meant to be pretty. But we do know that someone was living in these structures until at least 1941. Another 19th century addition, this was a blacksmith shop. A blacksmith, like the cook, really central to plantation life. They'd be making nails to, keep the roof on. They'd be helping the cooper make the metal bands that go around barrels, creating iron forks and spoons for the kitchen, hinges, locks, everything that would be needed to make a plantation successful. This too, unfortunately, was torn down in the 1950s or 60s. But we do have a survivor. This is a 19th century tobacco barn from John's era. And really, the only thing that's been touched on it is adding that new metal roof in the 1940s. And this is along what's called Quarter Place, which is historically the area where the enslaved lived from the 1790s until their free descendants moved away in about the 1950s. Another wonderful contemporary image done about 1904 of the original kitchen at Red Hill. You can see some of the cauldrons sitting out front. And to your left, you'll notice a very low log structure with a little black roof. That is the ice house. Now, as I mentioned, in 1865, emancipation finally came to the enslaved at Red Hill with the end of the Civil War. And John Henry took this piece of paper with his stationery, notice that H there, and actually walked Quarter Place and made a list of all 54 enslaved individuals living there. And if you look at the fourth person down, this man is named Harrison. Harrison is a really incredible figure in the history of Red Hill. This is a photograph of Harrison Henry taken probably in the 1880s, 1890s. He was born enslaved around 1798, so he was enslaved by Patrick Henry. He was listed as one of the 67 enslaved at Henry's death. And you can see he was one of the three sons of Criddy, the enslaved cook. He was first trained as an enslaved domestic servant working with Dorothea, but then was trained as a coachman and served in that role until emancipation. He died around the age of 108 in 1906. So not only did he outlive Patrick Henry, he also outlived John Henry. He outlived John Henry's son, William Wirt Henry, and saw the coming of Patrick Henry's great-grandson, Lucy Harrison, when she moved there in 1905. And this just a really incredible figure. And we do have part of his original house still standing here. This is Harrison's cabin. And you can see he's photographed sitting on the front steps of that cabin with his wife, Millie. Again, probably taken in the 1880s or 1890s. And we have refurnished this building today to reflect Harrison's time in this cabin around the 1870s or 1880s. In fact, he was given this structure to use as a home for the rest of his life by John Henry's son, probably in the 1870s. Now, it's during John Henry's time that the last burial takes place in the Henry family cemetery. So I thought it'd be a good moment to pause and talk about that. The Henry Cemetery spans about 1798 to 1875. Jane Robertson Henry, we believe, may be the first to be buried. She was Patrick Henry's 17th and last child. Unfortunately, she only lived 4 days after being born at Red Hill. She would be buried in a unmarked grave. She does have a marker there today, but of course, we only know that as an infant's grave. We can only guess that that might be her. And the last burial is of John's wife, Elvira McClellan, who died in 1875. You can see this color postcard image of what the Henry family cemetery looked like in the early 20th century. You'll see those two big box tombs of Dorothea and Patrick on the left, and John and his wife Elvira there on the right. In total, there are 7 Henry family members who are buried there who are marked, plus 3 unknown burials. And here you can get a better look at the box tombs of Patrick and Dorothea. Patrick buried on the right, Dorothea there on the left. These were not installed until 1858. It said that there was no marker above Henry's grave until that time. And same thing with Dorothea. She died February 14th, 1831. still probably not marked with anything more than a field stone or maybe a wood marker until their son John installed these in 1858. And those are still here today. Another cemetery we have on site is located way to the west of the house. So you'll notice if you look at the main grounds, those D-shaped boxwood gardens, way to the left is this red area. And this is Quarter Place Cemetery. This is at the end of Quarter Place itself. And this is where the enslaved and their freed African American descendants were buried. It was active about 1802 until the last burial is recorded in 1937. And you can see all these field stones. These are grave markers, both headstones and footstones. Through archaeology, we've determined that there are 147 individuals buried in this cemetery. Here's a better look at some of the typical field stones. There is, unfortunately, out of those 147, only one inscribed headstone, and that is of Matilda Pennell, who you see here. She was born enslaved 1861, died free in 1923, and it's really because of her that we've been able to identify to date 60 of those 147. So those 60 individuals, their identities are now known thanks to some great research from our genealogist at Red Hill. And we've also contacted, of course, descendants of those buried here. We've talked to about 300 or so to date. And here's an example of the archaeology map. This was done using LiDAR. This essentially happens when thousands of lasers are shot into the ground, and depending on how the ground is disturbed, the computer will read that as a disturbance. And if those disturbances are rectangular in shape, well, you've probably got yourself a grave. You'll notice that most everyone is buried around the central portion there, which is left empty. We're not entirely sure why that is, but there may have been a spiritually significant tree or some other item that was placed in the center there that folks were buried around. Every year, we do have what's called a Quarter Place Tribute, and this is where we celebrate the lives and legacies of the enslaved by inviting their descendants, local African American pastors, and their church members, traditional African dancers, to really learn the history of Red Hill that's not often as well known as Patrick Henry's story. Now, moving back into some of the folks, some of the people, we do have William Wirt Henry, grandson of Patrick Henry and son of John Henry. He took over the property after his father's death, but because he was a very successful lawyer, he was also the first president of the Virginia Society Sons of the American Revolution, president of the Virginia Historical Society. He only used Red Hill as a summer retreat. Not too much happened here during his time. And he gave most of the farm operations over to his brother, Dr. Thomas Henry. But one such building that was constructed during his time is this little one you see here on the right. This was William Wirt Henry's so-called law office. Small square building, pretty simple in form. Unfortunately, it no longer stands today. It was torn down, but we have this great image of it here in the 1950s when that was taken. The building on the left is Patrick Henry's original law office, which was later added onto, and Wirt Henry's law office was connected to this structure in the early 1900s. So that's the entirety of the building you're seeing here. At the original location of Wirt Henry's law office, because remember it was moved, we did some archaeology and in fact found a brick from those foundations of that building. And you can see a really personal connection to those brick makers here. And those are two finger indentations, which were made during the drying process, accidentally, of course. But that's a really interesting physical connection we have to some recently freed African American brick makers. And finally, we get to Lucy Gray Henry Harrison. A wonderful image of her here on the left. As I say, she always looks like a first-class passenger on the Titanic. She was very different from her great-grandfather. She was not really frugal. She loved the finer things in life. So she ordered a really significant expansion of the Henry Mansion and the landscape in general. Through this, there were African American sharecroppers and tenant farmers to sustain Lucy's wealth, and ultimately she would die in 1944, and she'd be the last Henry resident to live at Red Hill. So, about 1907, she hires a gentleman named Charles Barton Keene, a really popular architect specializing in the colonial revival style. Charles Barton Keene came to Red Hill and really expanded the mansion. But after his job at Red Hill finished around 1911, he then came down to Winston-Salem and constructed this real masterpiece about 1917 for a tobacco magnate down there, who I believe was named R.J. Reynolds. And this is the result of Charles Barton Keene's work. You can see again, much bigger than John Henry's house and a lot bigger than Patrick Henry's original home. Really incredible mansion. But how did we get there? So we'll start here with the 1832 John Henry house. We're going to pick up that extension on the right and move it by about 20 feet. Well, now we've got an empty space between those two structures. We got to fill it. And what do we do on the left to kind of balance things out? Well, we're going to duplicate the extension on the right on the left. So when everything was said and done in 1911, the mansion was completed in really elegant colonial revival style. You can see the entrance hall here, certainly built up from the earlier photograph you saw from 1895. The dining room with its lovely wood paneling, um, definitely some nice contemporary furniture. The library space, you can see Washington crossing the Delaware up above the mantle. And the bedroom. I love the wallpaper on this room. I always wish we could find a copy of it to see what the brilliant colors were like. And the parlor with the Henry family member just above the mantle. And Lucy Harrison's bedroom. Much simpler, you can see, than the more public areas like the dining room and the entrance hall. Here you get a good idea of the plans for the grounds and what Charles Barton Keene wanted to do in that space. Most of this did not come to fruition, but if you look here in the back, you'll notice this old cabin that is in fact this structure, and you may recognize part of this building. It's now a servant's quarter, but in the 19th century, it was the kitchen. So here we have the 1904 image with the about 1912 photograph. It has been built onto, and the kitchen was moved into the mansion after its construction. So that's why this building has now changed roles into the servants' quarter. A wonderful and rare photograph of some folks who may be the paid cook, maybe some maids you see here, and their family sitting in front of that building in 1919. And the ice house, because even if it's functional, it's got to be pretty. That's what Lucy's all about. So you've got the wonderful ice house here. You can certainly open that door and try to walk in, but the first step is a doozy because you'll fall probably about 20 or 30 feet down into the ground. And that's how obviously you would keep your ice cool. We've touched on this a little bit, but I know we're getting up to time here. But here's kind of a better idea of the extensions built on by Lucy Harrison. She moved this whole structure, connected her father's law office to it, and Patrick Henry's original pieces kind of squeezed in amongst all of these additions. And this is what the inside would have looked like at that time. So it was meant to be used as a caretaker's cottage, but then after a really significant incident, the burning of the mansion, Lucy moved into that building full time. Unfortunately, in February of 1919, the mansion did burn to the ground and it was never rebuilt. So we do have this sad image of the open ruins here in 1950. Once our foundation purchased the site, we would cover up these ruins and restore the property to as we thought it looked in the 18th century. And that's where we get to the 1940s. The Patrick Henry Memorial Foundation is formed. We're coming in and we have proposed restorations. We'll reconstruct the house, take off all the later additions to the law office, restore Henry's grave. So a really romantic look into the plantation setting, not totally accurate to the 18th century, more so a 1950s look back on what the 18th century should look like. So here, 1956, we are reconstructing the Henry House as we thought it looked. Uh, we later learned that the addition on the right and the lean-to addition on the left were not part of Patrick Henry's original home. So that was a little bit of a mistake in the 1950s, but I'll give them a pass since the internet was not invented yet, and they were definitely doing their best. But you can see here, we're still living large today with a reconstructed house. The 1850s boxwood still standing, Harrison's cabin, the reconstructed kitchen. And you may also notice that great big tree, the big yellow tree there behind the house. That's our Osage orange tree, the longest lived resident of Red Hill, about 350 years old and a national champion. So it is the largest of its kind in the United States. So if anything, come see that because that is certainly original to Red Hill, very much original. But with that, that is the end of my presentation. I will stop sharing here and turn it back over for questions.
Okay, that was amazing. Learned lots of things. We don't have any questions yet. I'm hoping people are typing now. And to give people a chance to ask their questions, I will ask one first. And how did Patrick Henry even find Red Hill? It's not exactly on the beaten path between Richmond and Williamsburg and Hanover.
You're right about that. Henry was not one for city living. In fact, he only lived in one city house full time. That was the governor's palace. Later, the executive mansion in Richmond. That really wasn't a nice spot. Henry didn't live there. He rented a place in Chesterfield rather than live downtown. Downtown, very much a lowercase d at that time. So Henry was always looking to buy new properties. That was one of his hobbies that we say. He loved land acquisition and land surveying. So he came to Campbell County 2 years before he popped into Red Hill in 1792, purchased a place called Long Island. But as Henry wrote, that really wasn't in the center of the social life. His daughters were kind of complaining he was out in the middle of nowhere. So 2 years later, he purchased Red Hill, in my opinion, still very far from any kind of social life, being someone who lives here. But apparently it worked because, again, uh, Dolly Spotswood met and married the love of her life at Red Hill. So um, that's that's kind of Henry's story with land acquisition there.
That makes perfect sense. But I agree with you. It's not exactly the hotbed of social activity, but
No.
it is beautiful for sure.
Yes, we're known for our pastoral beauty. We have 1,000 acres of untouched land. Our view shed looks the same as it did 250 years ago. So we're very pleased for that.
Indeed. You're getting lots of, how is Red Hill supported today?
That's a great question. So even though we are a national memorial designated by Congress, the Patrick Henry Memorial Foundation is a private nonprofit, a 501(c)(3). So we receive no federal or state funding. Most of our money comes from private donations and from grants.
Okay, we might have to discuss a GRIVA field trip.
Yes.
Karen says, visiting Red Hill, when can one come to see Red Hill?
Well, we are open every day of the week. We're only closed New Year's Day, Christmas Day, and Thanksgiving Day. So you've got a lot of chances to visit us. And when you come in, you'll have a little orientation, and then the grounds are all self-guided. You can tour the buildings, see Patrick Henry in the cemetery at your leisure. And we also have a museum space that includes the largest collection of Patrick Henry artifacts in the US.
Excellent. Um, we visited years ago, and I think we were told Patrick Henry's wife was mad and confined to the basement. Is that true?
Yes, so Patrick Henry's first wife is, I think, better known than his second wife, Dorothea, really because of her battle with mental illness. And over the years, it has turned into myth and legend within Hanover County. And this would have happened at a place called Scotchtown Plantation. It was Henry's largest home he ever purchased in 1771, we think, for the care of his wife, because Sarah was suffering from a kind of mental illness. We're not quite sure what it was called, but we know it may have been something similar to mania, perhaps bipolar. She did have to be restrained in a straight dress, but one of the benefits of Scotchtown was that it had an English basement, meaning the basement walls were raised above grade, and there were some large windows in that space.
Your message.
We do certainly think that Sarah was better cared for at Scotchtown rather than going to Eastern State Hospital in Williamsburg. She would have been cared for at home. The basement was quiet, cool during the summer, away from her noisy family. And unfortunately, that is where she would die in 1775.
And just before you said Scotchtown, another member had commented that Patrick Henry also lived in Scotchtown in Hanover County. His wife was ill and lived there in the basement. Okay, so how did historians come to agree on what Henry actually said at his famous speech at St. John's Church?
That's a good question. They haven't. Still to this day, there is no consensus on what exactly Henry said at St. John's Church. Henry's reconstructed speech, it was first kind of mashed back together, beginning with his first biographer, a gentleman named William Wirt, for Henry's first biography in 1817. And William Wirt was talking with a lot of members who were still alive who attended Henry's speech. So he was getting a lot of oral histories from that. But we also know that Wirt took a bit of creative license in some of the words. But there's multiple people who do assert that those last famous words, give me liberty or give me death, were certainly said by Patrick Henry. So if anything, that is true.
Makes sense. Okay, I'm thrilled to see the photos of enslaved people. Was it unusual to have portraits made of enslaved people at that time?
Yes, it really was. That's a very rare occurrence. We are very lucky to have um, two drawings of Harrison Henry, one drawing of his wife Millie, and two photographs of Harrison and one photograph of Millie. We also, a couple of years ago, acquired an image of a recently freed African American nanny who lived at Whinstone, who was she was part of the adjoining plantation of Red Hill. So yes, it was very rare that photographs were taken of them. And you may have noticed that most of those images were taken in the 1880s, 1890s or so. And this was during a time period where a lot of Southerners were looking back on slavery with a kind of romantic lens. They viewed formerly enslaved people as being um, kind of the image of the loyal slave in the past, who stood with their masters through tough times. But certainly we have Harrison, for instance, who's taking control of those images, and he's dressed in his Sunday best. He's always with his tie, with his coat. So he's definitely very proud of these photographs that are being taken of him.
As well, he should be. He's a handsome man.
Yes.
Right. Can you say something about George C. Marshall's home where you used to work? I did not know I was his cousin through the Catlets and the Talaferros when I attended George C. Marshall High School in Fairfax County.
So General Marshall is, in my opinion, the greatest American of the 20th century. No other American was responsible for victory over the Nazis during World War II and was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize and was Secretary of State with the Marshall Plan. I could go on. That's a separate presentation. But yes, Marshall did live in Leesburg, Virginia, a place called Dodona Manor. You did say it correctly, Paula. Wonderful job.
Thank you.
He moved into an 1820s house in 1941, lived there until 1959. This was his only permanent home, and it is open as a museum today, and about 90 to 95% of those furnishings are original. So a really great look into the personal life of this very public figure.
Nice. You talked about a whole other presentation. I was tempted to ask about LIDAR, but I'm sure can be a total different. That looked fascinating as well. All right, the last question. Have descendants of the enslaved settled nearby?
Yes, great question, Robin. Something that we've noticed with Red Hill is that if the enslaved did not leave the property itself, they either moved nearby to a what they call a freedmen's community, which is just up the road, called Falling River. The detailed history on that is very scarce. We're still doing research on that freedmen's community. So they're separated from the plantation that they knew, but they're still close enough to be engaged with any family members who may still be there, and they're in an area they recognize. Um, some other folks moved throughout Campbell County, moved to Brookneal, the town nearby. And even today, we do have a lot of members, the Pinnells, for example, a big family that is still located in and around Brookneal, and they are descendants of those enslaved both at Red Hill and Whinstone.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. You've got lots of wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Gorgeous slides, very well done, very informative and interesting. So all kinds of great comments. And we thank you very much for spending this evening with us. We've all learned a lot.
Thank you for having me, Paula, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you. I was saying actual literal clapping of hands, not even just the reaction buttons.
Thank you.